Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I want to welcome you. My name is Dr. Cecilia Tamori. I'm an associate professor and director of global public health and community health at the Johns Hopkins School of Nursing and also at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I head up the engagement group for the Opioid Industry Documents Archive team. And it's our great pleasure to welcome you to our first research workshop, exploring the opioid industry documents, research communities, educational opportunities, and community data. Let me just walk you through a little bit of housekeeping. We are going to get started with our plenary talk in just a moment. When you are thinking of questions that you may want to pose, please feel free to put them into the Q&A area. When we are ready, we will then facilitate a Q&A session at the end of the talk, and then we will move on to our other speakers. So first of all, also quick acknowledgements. I want to acknowledge the Johns Hopkins Center for Medical Humanities and Social Medicine, who is our wonderful host today, and also our collaboration between Johns Hopkins University and UCSF, who collaborate to host this wonderful archive. Okay, so with the housekeeping in mind and we're all set, I would love to move on to introducing our wonderful plenary speaker, Professor Keith Wei-Liu, who is Henry Putnam University Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University, as well as the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. Now, Professor Wei-Liu has many, many accomplishments, and I'm not going to get into all the details, but I want you all to know that he has written numerous award-winning books, and he's going to be talking a little bit about Pushing Cool, and particularly his most recent book, which extensively uses archival work. And obviously he has received numerous awards, such as the Dan David Prize, and was also elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So this is a very, very abbreviated introduction, but I'll turn it over. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, for the introduction and also for the invitation to talk about my previous work in the Truth Tobacco Industry Documents as they pertain to the opportunities provided by the Opioid Industry Documents Archive. So I've been asked to talk a little bit based on the fact that I wrote this book, Pushing Cool, about the benefits and challenges of navigating a born digital archival collection, to reflect a bit on the process of doing research and writing the book Pushing Cool, which is about the history of the tobacco industry's marketing and development of the menthol cigarette. And to talk about how research in the tobacco collection helped to generate unanticipated questions and findings, and then finally to reflect on implications for the OIDA Research Archive. For those of you who don't know, most of you probably do, the Truth Tobacco Archive is a fairly extensive one, an archive of over 14 million documents that are created by tobacco companies about their advertising, manufacturing, marketing, and the scientific research and political activities that was hosted by the UCSF library. And this archive, among many other archives, well, this archive in particular was produced as a result of the master settlement agreement between states attorneys generals, the Department of Justice, and numerous sectors of the industry in 1998, which provides an unparalleled look behind the curtain at the history of industry practices. This archive, alongside archival holdings at Penn State University, Hagley Museum and Library, Columbia, Duke University, as well as digitized medical science and public media, as well as looking at digitized newspapers and a lot of other records, went into writing this book on the history, the tangled and complicated history of the mentholated cigarette. What I want to do today is to give you just a very quick overview of some things that I learned as I delved into the tobacco documents by focusing on how a single term, a single search term like menthol, could evolve into an entire book that looks behind the curtain to understand a web of relationships and strategies and practices that evolved over the course of more than a century. And the goal here is to sort of begin the conversation about how the work in the tobacco archives could be useful in thinking about how to navigate the OIDA archives. Now, one second, I'm just going to try to move my screen around a little bit here. One of the Of course, the truth tobacco industry documents cover some basic elements of internal communications within different firms in the tobacco industry so that you're able to have this unparalleled insight into sort of administrative, executive decision-making and research, as well as the work of consultants for the industry, communications with those consultants, and the kinds of smoker surveys and a wide range of documents that are produced in service of the industry. And for me, it was documents like this, Searching Menthol in the 1960s, where my curiosity about the history of menthol smoking started. It was documents like this, which were a study of smokers' attitudes, especially Black smokers' attitudes towards the Salem brand and the Kool brand in April of 1969, which made a fairly bold claim. And that is that Kool was in the Negro market, and it is the cigarette to smoke. And the name itself not only describes a desirable product property, it is also a perfect match with what may be the most highly valued personality trait among Negroes, i.e. savoir-faire or coolness. And you could see why this claim sits at the center of tobacco advertising in the 1960s, this notion that there's a special affinity between Black people and Kool cigarettes would draw my attention and prompt me to ask this broader question, which is, not only is this true, but what is the basis of this claim? And is there a backstory to the claim? So whether or not you're writing a book about an archive like this or an article, it starts with a question. What could the archives reveal about, in this case, menthols that are not already evident in looking at advertisements, public sources, like an advertisement like this from the 1940s, in which Kool claims that it's a treatment for what is called smoker's throat, or an advertisement like this from the 1950s in which their mascot, Willie the Penguin, says, when April showers make you cough like crazy, refreshing Kools taste fresh as a daisy. If you got a cough, switch from Hots to Kools. So the documents give you a sense of how you go from that kind of claim, which is at the centerpiece of how Kools emerged on the smoker market in the 1930s into the 1940s and 50s, to this kind of marketing pitch in the 1960s, 70s, into the 80s and beyond. The notion that Kool was not just a health cigarette as it was understood in the early days, but a Black themed cigarette as it became reconceptualized. How did that transformation happen? How, when, and did menthol cigarettes become a Black campaign theme? So my study, as I looked more closely, gathering documents, just continuing to search what menthols meant across time, became a study of how markets are made and remade, health markets into racially inflected markets. Early in the century, menthol cigarettes had nothing to do with race. And if you ask any industry executive or look for any documents that made it such a claim, you wouldn't find them because they were pitched as health products. And it became a study of how you understand and track a changing business rationale, how menthol smoking began, surprisingly, as a defensive concern to reassure smokers about this thing called smoker's cough. The book became, in time, the study of the people behind these campaigns, the backstory to the advertising behind the image. Who were the researchers? Who were the physiologists, the psychologists, the urban sociologists, the people informing the industry? People like Howard Haggard at Yale University, who was approached by marketers for a cool cigarette in the 1930s, who wanted to study a competing company's claim that menthols were damaging. And so Howard Haggard, as a physiologist, began to study this and made some observations about menthol as a perversion of sensation, but also explained to the marketers that while he was happy to provide this contract service, that they should not use his material for marketing. And then a few years later, they came up to him and they said, we'd like to use your material for marketing. And this document from 1935 is one in which he objects, and he says, it's exactly this exploitation that you're now suggesting, even though I told you that I didn't want my research exploited in this way. So the tensions, you might say, over brand competition, the tensions between scientists, consultants, marketers, and the industry became much more central to the history of the of menthol cigarettes in general. Beyond company correspondences, the Tobacco Truth Documents also offers an unparalleled amount of data. You could actually reconstruct a great deal about the sales, about brand preferences, because the industry spent enormous amounts of time and resources tracking these. Working with organizations like we tend to forget that colleges were the main market for tobacco in the 1950s. Tobacco ads ran heavily in college newspapers, but they were also under increasing scrutiny in the 1950s for these kinds of practices. And so the industry took very, very careful, followed very carefully sales preferences for Salem, for Winston and Salem, intimately, quarter by quarter, university by university in the early 1960s. And so one of the things that's really surprising about this documentation is behind the image you see here of the young people smoking filtered cools, there's a great level of local specificity and attention to both brand and region in these documents. So one of the recurring surprises of delving deeply, doing a search on menthol, is the extraordinary detail and specific local knowledge that the industry amasses about attitudes, city by city, sometimes neighborhood by neighborhood, campus by campus, economic conditions, health anxieties. When health anxieties begin to rise, linking smoking to cancer in the 1950s and 1960s, the industry becomes aware of the fact that filtered cigarettes are seen by smokers as safer, and so are menthols. And as a result, menthol sales and filtered cigarette sales rise. And the industry begins to study health psychology as a way of understanding how you pivot towards menthol and build menthol brands as health brands for these to meet these new health anxieties of the 50s and 1960s. So the industry is constantly studying health anxieties and health concerns. They're doing health psychology, they're studying smoker psychology, and they're also building relationships that help to support smoking behavior and brand choice. The intensity of their strategic focus in building markets is one of the things I found most surprising, whether that was in thinking about college promotion kits, that is college-themed mascot-specific, school-specific money giveaways depending on the campus, or whether it's studies like this in Chicago, which tracks feelings of racism, particularly anti-Black racism, around Chicago in the late 1970s among white people that are more aggravated than in the country generally, in which they conclude that anti-Black feelings are also expressed in people's dislike for integrated ads, so that the logic behind which ads are marketed where has very much to do with these kinds of studies that were done to try to anticipate and understand anxieties, attitudes, economic concerns, and psychology. One of the major research challenges of this project, besides just like navigating through millions and millions of documents to find those that are relevant to you, is to identify the key actors and organizations, the companies, the brands, the executives, the studies, and the consultants that are really crucial to one particular moment in time and how those companies, brands, executives, studies, and consultants change. It's a kind of a constantly changing web of relationships. Understanding the business tensions, the strategies and motivations that evolve from the 30s into the 40s, into the 50s and beyond is another major challenge. And then really managing the complexity of the archive. In some ways, creating an archive of the archive becomes an important one. But it's by tracking these individuals that you're able to see, for me, the central important role of people like Howard Haggard as a the Haggard correspondence, which figures prominently in my first chapter in Menthol's early years, or the work of the founder of a company called the Institute for Motivational Research, Ernest Dichter, who discovers and argues that menthol is emergingly popular because it's seen as an evasion by many smokers of the cancer question, as a key figure in my second chapter. And so I just put these images up to illustrate just how collecting documents, PDFs, having a sense of what's in those documents, and going back to them when it came time to write is a crucial kind of management strategy for turning an archive ultimately into a chapter and a chapter into a book. The Truth Tobacco Industry Documents also cover contextual developments, because the industry is not just about tracking its internal dynamics, but also following exogenous, external developments, whether they're hearings or legislative developments or news clippings that have some bearing on sales or the industry itself. And so particularly after the 1964 Surgeon General report that links tobacco with cancer, the industry becomes, they've always been attentive to the public media, but they become even more attentive to these kinds of developments. And so the archive itself is how the industry archives these developments, whether it's the controversy around the Surgeon General's report in '64 or new controversies that emerge in the 1980s over R.J. Reynolds's new effort to market a new Black-themed menthol brand called Uptown, and the scathing criticism that they meet from Louis Sullivan, the then Secretary for Health and Human Services, calling Uptown's message more suffering, more death for a group already bearing more than its share of smoking-related illness and mortality. This tension with Louis Sullivan and the support that the industry seeks from the executive director, surprisingly, of the NAACP, Benjamin Hooks, in defense of the Uptown campaign, provides the centerpiece of a later chapter of the book. So the industry documents show a lot. They show internal dynamics, and they show how firms sought to manage the fallout of these kinds of controversies. The Uptown controversy, it shows how the firm sought to rebuild markets that were lost when the Congress banned nationwide television and radio advertising of cigarettes. It showed how the industry sought to recover from the controversy created by the Uptown branding. And it showed how they tracked and studied the effects of emerging local public health activism, like the work of the work of people like Henry McNeil Brown, who went by the name Mandrake. He was a vigilante who would, at the dead of night, do blackwashing and whitewashing of alcohol and tobacco billboards across Chicago. And his vandalism was actually echoed in other communities in New York and Philadelphia and Dallas. And the industry followed these trends very carefully. So in some ways, the archive becomes a way of understanding how tobacco politics is changing. So the Truth Tobacco Industry Documents cover a wide range of strategies. And for me, it became a study of what I call the push, which is why the book is called Pushing Cool. And also the forces behind the push, the social scientists, the pollsters, the psychologists, the urban studies scholars, even the gender theorists. And the push was not always successful. Let me just make this clear. One of the companies that really never built a successful menthol brand was Philip Morris. And here's a study from 1971 in which they're asking the question, why is it that the cowboy image that has proven so successful in transforming menthol, Marlboro, from a feminine brand into a robust, manly, masculine brand in the 1950s, why is it that it never gained traction in urban Black America? And here's a study from 71, which says you have to understand Black masculinity in relationship to white masculinity. So in some ways, the industry is generating and developing, race and sexuality studies, masculinity studies, and studies of femininity long before these were, or not long before, but around the same time that these are developing as fields of study in the academy itself. So there's surprising developments in terms of the way in which particular ideas about masculinity, gender, race are being deployed, being studied, and then being deployed in advertising. The menthol cigarette story became then the story of, for me, the slow way in which markets are made and remade. The menthol search is a simple search term, but it produces so much information that the challenge becomes, how do you create a storyline? How do you learn what the backstory is of this intense brand competition that evolves over the course of decades? It also became a story that is about explaining the rise of targeted racial urban marketing, particularly in the 1960s. And the argument in the book becomes that it's really the intensification of scrutiny of the college youth-focused advertising in the 50s that prompts the industry to pivot to urban marketing more intensely in the 1960s. And it's in this context that this kind of pitch, a health pitch, becomes this kind of pitch. And this is the fulcrum chapter that you see building in my chapter 3, Building a Black Franchise. It also becomes a study of shining a light on the central role of the players behind these events, the central role of consultants in psychology, physiology, sociology, and marketing in shaping markets and creating preferences and identities. And we often think about consumer preferences as something that are driven internally by the pull, right? That I personally like a certain kind of brand. What the industry documents allow us to understand is the elaborate nature of the push, how demand is created, right? How the push drives these markets and creates markets. I want to just sort of conclude by saying a few things about the implications for the opioid industry documents. When I look at the opioid industry documents, I ask a similar kind of question. How can a particular search term open into a broader story? One of the phrases that became part of the Purdue Pharma campaign very early on in the history of OxyContin was partners against pain. It highlights a central business strategy of building partnerships in order to build OxyContin markets. And so one of the things I did just a couple days ago is I decided to just search the term partners against pain. And one of the first documents you come across is just one slide presentation from very early on in the history of OxyContin, November 2001, at a meeting in which you begin to see already what we now know today, right? Which is how partnerships build markets. I'm not going to get down to the level of specificity, but these documents give a great deal of understanding of the who, particular people, who the regional directors are, what kinds of specific relationships are being formed, et cetera. But I want to just highlight the same kinds of processes that you find here in these archives. as I said, these are just from one sales presentation in November of 2001. And one of the slides talks about the importance of building a sales force, in this case, a sales force of 886 people responsible for generating demand for our products at the clinician level. So from the industry's perspective, this is about how you generate demand. And another slide highlights that the sales department has grown dramatically from 1997, 388,000 to almost a million, 388,000 total primary care physician calls made to almost a million by 2001. And then also highlights that, but this is a year that's really crucial. And this is a strategy of doing historical research for me, which is to focus in on a year by year, sometimes month by month analysis of the archives to try to understand, what the possibilities were at this particular moment, who the actors are, what are the networks, and what are the relationships being formed. And as this document highlights, 2001 was an interesting but also challenging year for sales and field operation. Why? Well, because OxyContin abuse was already quite evident at this time, as was drug diversion, and there were lawsuits already evident. And one of the key challenges of the industry is how do you navigate these controversies? One of the ways the industry did find a way to navigate them is to figure out a way beyond these so-called distractions. As the sales presentation pointed out, despite the many challenges, we had a very good year. And the sales projected for 2001 would be 1.4 billion. And these are their images. These are not mine, right? So you can actually look at the images to try to understand the story that they are telling internally. The document also describes the strategies for the future, which would involve a multi-pronged coordinated approach. On the one hand, battling against Medicaid programs in which there might be skeptics about robust prescribing of OxyContin, building liaisons through educational programs by working with medical boards, pharmacy boards, and what are called thought leaders, seeking new OxyContin opportunities for 2002 with thought leaders in particular fields like anesthesia, or strengthening the cornerstone of our pain franchise. And here's that term again, the pain franchise with oncologists. So this is just one very kind of high-level discussion of one document that emerges out of the search Partners Against Pain, which, like menthol, can begin the process of illuminating the backstory of how markets are made. So I will end there. I will stop sharing my screen, and I'm certainly happy to take any questions that anyone would like to pose.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Welu, for that incredible, enlightening presentation. I want to quickly introduce, before we jump into Q&A, and while I'm, prepping everyone, please start populating any questions you may have into the Q&A now. I certainly have plenty, and I don't want to colonize the conversation, but I just wanted to, again, thank you very much for an enlightening talk. My name is Jason Chernesky. I am the OIDA Industry Document Archive. The Opioid Industry Document Archive is OIDA Clear Research Fellow postdoc here that's working on community engagement and outreach for the program. I'm also a historian of medicine, public health, and environmental history here at the Johns Hopkins University Institute, the History of Medicine. I will be monitoring Q&A. I will also be in the workshop portion later. So I just wanted to introduce myself now, and I could talk a little bit more about me later. But I want to stay focused here on what Dr. Welu has presented, because as that last bit in the presentation did so well, Dr. Welu, is you really showed how that, taking one term or phrase or something can not only, bring you to a document that can illuminate a number of stories, but in there, you were also in the slide, that last slide, you start to see the language or the vocabulary that industry uses to talk to one another, but also that's very important for navigating what is an otherwise tangle of a lot of very complicated, technical, insular or arcane vocabulary. So I wonder if we could start, as many of the questions begin to populate. I'd like to just maybe start with one of my own. And it's for everyone who wants to start using this collection or the OIDA collection in particular, maybe what if you could sort of talk a little bit about how you started to build an archive of the vocabulary. So how you're starting to build out, what are the types of words they're using for certain things that you will then start to pump into the database to pull up more documents. So just kind of curious about your process there and how you started to do that.
Yeah, well, with regard, you're quite right to say that understanding the language is crucial. So two comments about this. One is that we tend to look for the terms that we think are important right now, when in fact, the terminology, so for instance, the language of thought leaders, the idea that the industry understood that one needs to build not so much like-minded people, but people who are shaping broader thinking and thought about pain and about balanced and thoughtful approaches to pain is the way in which you bring you create consensus and you build partnerships. So it's understanding that there's a language of partnerships that is being developed that creates these kinds of coalitions. In the history of the Tobacco Archive, there is this long-standing notion that once the industry pivoted towards working with and marketing intensively to Black populations, they built close relationship with Black civic leaders, with the NAACP and others. And it was always this theme of kind of Black pride and Black power and Black self-determination that were part of. So there's a kind of empowerment theme that the industry learns. There's a language of empowerment that the industry learned. And it's hard to resist in some ways, because after all, who could be opposed to Black pride and Black power and Black self-determination? But it's these kinds of strategies that, alongside monetary support for civic organizations, could help the industry to withstand criticism. And so I think the lesson that I learned from the menthol story that applies here is that what the industry in building thought leaders is actually creating a system not only for building markets, but also for safeguarding itself against criticism, right? That somehow it's doing something that is contrary to the interest of patients. In fact, this is about, patients and self-determination and pain. So that's a good example of how the language of marketing also is the language of sort of storytelling, right? Of telling people stories that give them a sense of their being on the right side of this fight.
That's great. That's really wonderful. And also there's some really interesting corollaries here between what you're saying, how the sort of, the logics of race are sort of infused into the way that menthol cigarettes are marketed, but also going out to Black leaders, right, or developing a language that, or harnessing a language at the time that then gets sort of used to, do this push that you're so, wonderfully telling in the story, in the book. and the story writ large, but you also see this in the opioid industry documents too, where, for example, I've come across stuff where health disparities then starts to become, right, like, so this language of inequity that is either coded in or implicit in something like health disparities or, unequal access to pain medications, for example, you start to see an adoption of this. And it would be interesting for folks to sort of maybe delineate when and how that actually happens. But absolutely, these logics cut across industry, which is really one of the powerful things that your story tells us, but also the industry document library as a whole can do, including, of course, the opioid industry documents. I have a question here from Julia Kaminsky. Comiskey, sorry, I put an N in there for some reason. Maybe because I'm a baseball fan. So here's her question, and Dr. Whaley, you can answer it if you see fit. So how important do you think it is for users of these archives, so the industry archives, to understand the circumstances that led to their creation? So maybe you could talk about, your experience, and we can, go from there.
Yeah, I would say it's very important, partly because, even though this is unparalleledly, it's an incredibly rich archive, we should understand that any archive that's produced as a result of a legal settlement will only produce the materials that are relevant to that legal settlement, right? So these are only the archival materials that relate to, in the case of the tobacco archives, marketing, advertising, right, and sales. And there's, of course, a lot of other issues in the industry that aren't really part of this legal process. So we ought to be understand, but Julia Kaminsky is right that those circumstances in which the archive is created give us a sense of the kinds of, they constrain the sorts of stories that can be told, but they also unleash just an amazing number of possibilities. But there are going to be gaps. There are multiple gaps in the story. This is why, I consider these archives to be kind of like a research assistant, right? Whenever I do digital work, yes, it's like I'm sending a research assistant out to find me all of this really amazing stuff. But I had to do more work to figure out who Howard Haggard was or who Ernest Dichter was. And I had to actually go to, or have another student go to the Ernest Dichter archives at Hagley, and I had to do more research on Ernest Dichter in order to fully contextualize and understand what he was all about in terms of the work he did for industry. And some of the rich material I found on Ernest Dichter came out of his archive rather than the tobacco industry documents. So in some ways, I would say that it's important to understand that the archives lead you to places, but it's up to you to continue the research to try to find out where else, how else to enrich your understanding of the story.
That's great, and thanks, Julie, for that wonderful question. We got about 4 or 5 minutes, and Louisa Holmes has one here, Dr. Whaley, about data organization and tracking, and that you talked about it in the presentation, but I think that, as you were saying, this might speak to your building the archive of the archive, right? It can get a little bit unwieldy when dealing with such massive born digital collections. And so Louisa's asking, if you could talk a little bit more, how do you, strategies for keeping track of all the documents that you're uncovering and notate, for future reference, like what you may have found as an effective or efficient way of doing that. And obviously with the caveat that this was how you did it, and we all have our own sort of, organizational schemes, but maybe you could just sort of speak to that, building of the archive piece that you were mentioning before.
Yeah, so this is a really great question and a very important one, Louisa. And what I would say is, every researcher, I think, has their own strategy, and mine involves collecting PDFs, and the PDF is a wonderful organizational tool, but it's also incredibly cumbersome because you read it through, and nowadays it's increasingly easy to annotate PDFs. The way I would do this, though, is that because I'm a historian, I have a year by year way of organizing my thinking, right? What was going on in Purdue Pharma in November 2001 to me is a concrete, specific question. And so I would tend to have PDFs that begin with the title November 2001 or 2001 November. And then often as I read through them, I have a system for separately writing out what I think is important about that document, but also the title I give to the PDF. If you remember from the slide that I showed, let me go back to it. It reminds me, I'm going to share my screen for a second. The title is intended to illustrate the particular time and also the specific reason why I think this document is central to the story of the menthol cigarette. So this Howard Haggard document, 1934, on people who work at Spud. So Spud was one of the first menthol brands. And there was a theory, it's almost kind of laughable now. There was a theory that people who work in Spud factories were exposed to so much menthol that they didn't get colds as much as as other people did, that menthol was somehow a protective against getting a cold. And Howard Haggard was asked to weigh in on this question. And so this was the kind of topic that was at the forefront of, when I document that, it's the Howard Haggard on Spud and cold, so that I can go back even years later and say, yeah, that's that document. And so I need to retrieve it to bring it into my story somehow. So it involves, as you're gathering, early on, you don't know what the story is. So you tend to read and you have hunches as to where the story is going to lead. After you've amassed a fair bit of an archive, you start to see patterns. And when you start to see patterns, that's when your documentation strategy for me becomes more specific, because then you begin documenting in relationship to the patterns that you see, because the patterns become the story. If Howard Haggard had only showed up once in these archives, then I would have seen him once and it would have been totally unnoteworthy. But because he showed up several times as a consultant, commenting, I could see that his role was going to be substantial for me as a scholar, as a historian, and as somebody trying to analyze this as a moment in time. So I can't give a more concrete answer than that, other than it's an unfolding story, because what you are discovering as you do the research is itself unfolding. And so, it'd be great if now that I know what the story is, I could go back and I could say, oh yeah, this document belongs here, this document belongs there. It took me at least a couple of years to figure out what even the story was in its broadest outlines before I could start to say, I'm going to focus on these particular characters.
That's great. And I think that's a great segue too, as we move into the overview of the collection, talking about, these patterns and this is something we'll go over in the workshop a little bit when we do our breakout sessions with everyone, is trying to devise ways as we're navigating what can sometimes be an unwieldy data set to start putting those things together for however you're doing this research or for whatever purposes you're doing the research for. As Professor Welu was saying, for historians, those of us, we have a particular way of organizing and collecting our data. Maybe for someone like Adam Kuhn, who's going to be talking about health policy research, or GB, who's going to be talking about, business scholarship, right? All of those things are going to matter differently, but following those patterns is really essential in sort of navigating this sort of web of, interlocking documents that on the surface don't seem to be connected, but obviously, right, we're putting them together, we're the glue. Again, I wanted to thank you so much, Dr. Whalen, for this presentation and giving us some really great things to talk about in our workshop and ways of thinking about how to navigate this site and asking those kinds of questions based on, and I love this, starting with a search term and then how it kind of then sort of blossoms into a larger narrative, however big that narrative may be. And that's something we'll be going over in our workshop when we talk about snowball search strategies. So this is a perfect setup for that. And I wanted to thank you again for taking the time.
Thank you, Jason. Glad to be here.
I'm moving on to Kate Tasker, who is the Industry Document Library Managing Archivist at UCSF. I will let Kate provide a little bit more information about herself before she does her presentation, but she will be giving us an overview of the collections as a whole and OIDA specifically. So if you have any questions at all, please populate them in the Q&A tab, and I'll be sure to read them out so we all can hear them, but also that Kate can answer them. So Kate, without further ado, take it away.
Thanks so much, Jason. And thank you, Dr. Welu and Dr. Tamori for providing the introduction today. That fantastic presentation on research in the documents and the long history of the Truth Tobacco Industry Documents Archive, and how this is really building us a foundation for maximizing the impact of documents coming out of opioid industry litigation and just the potential for research and other kinds of analysis that exist here. So good afternoon, good morning, depending on your time zone. My name is Kate Tasker. I am the managing archivist for the entire Industry Documents Library at UCSF. I'm also the co-lead for the Opioid Industry Documents Archive project, which we are working on here in collaboration with Johns Hopkins University, along with my counterpart and co-lead, Dr. Caleb Alexander at JHU. So following Dr. Welu's talk, I'm really here to provide an overview of the Industry Documents Library as a whole, its history, collections, and long public health impact, and give an introduction to how the Opioid Industry Documents Archive is building on this model to provide access to millions of previously internal documents from the opioid industry for research and public benefit. So many of you may have used the Industry Documents Library before, but for those who are new to the collections, the Industry Documents Library, or IDL, is a digital portal to millions of documents that were created by industries that influence public health. It's hosted by the University of California, San Francisco Library, and it's managed by a team of archivists and technologists. It began in the early 2000s as the Legacy Tobacco Documents Library, but it now includes more than 18 million documents related to the tobacco, opioid, chemical, drug, food, and fossil fuel industries. So as Dr. Welu was describing, the documents are a very extensive record of corporate activity, including marketing campaigns, public relations strategies, industry-funded research, and lobbying and regulatory influence. The bulk of the documents generally date from the 1970s through the 1990s, but we are continuing to add new documents very regularly. And with the Opioid Industry Documents Archives in particular, these documents date from the 1990s all the way through the present day. So what is in this archive? What's in IDL? The answer to that question is really the records that you would expect to find inside the file cabinets and hard drives of a large corporation or an executive saved files. They include internal memos, letters, emails, presentation slides, conference proceedings, marketing plans and reports, and sales data, board minutes, unpublished scientific studies, advertisements, including video and audio recordings, as well as legal transcripts and depositions and many other materials. On this slide, there's a stock image, which is just here to illustrate the vast scale of the collection when we're talking about millions and millions of documents. But I should clarify that the IDL does not actually house any physical documents. All of the collections are digital and available online. So the documents come from a wide variety of sources, including whistleblowers, litigation, public records requests, legal and journalist sources, and other libraries and archives who we partner with to digitize paper collections and add them for cross-searching across the collections. Logos of some of the companies that are represented in the documents are shown here. If you're interested in learning more about how we collect documents, or if you're aware of documents which could be added to the library, please check out the website, look on our About page, or you can contact me with questions. We're always interested in learning more about other sources of material, making sure we have a complete set as possible. So kind of winding back to the very beginning of the tobacco documents in particular, to set the scene for how these collections have been established, the growth, the impact, and where they're heading. So the first documents at the library came in a box, which was sent by an anonymous whistleblower at the Brown and Williamson Tobacco Company back in May of 1994. The whistleblower used the code name Mr. Butts as the return address. This was after the famous cartoon character in the Doonesbury comic strip. Mr. Butts sent this box of paper documents to UCSF professor Dr. Stanton Glantz. And Dr. Glantz, as many of you will know, is an internationally recognized expert and leader in tobacco control. He was the founding director of the UCSF Center for Tobacco Control Research and Education, and he played an instrumental role in establishing the documents library at UCSF. So Dr. Glantz looked at the 4,000 pages of documents in this box, and he saw that they provided an unprecedented opportunity to learn about the inner workings of the tobacco industry. The documents dated from the early 1950s to the early 1980s, and they consisted primarily of confidential internal memos and scientific studies on the addictive nature of nicotine and other health effects of tobacco smoke. So they clearly showed that the company Brown and Williamson was aware of the dangers of smoking, but that the company had continued to deny those dangers to the public. Many of the documents contained internal discussion of the tobacco industry's public relations and legal strategies, and they were often labeled confidential or privileged. Copies of these documents had actually also been sent to other public health experts and to journalists, but organizations were understandably quite reluctant to make them public because of the risk of being sued by the industry. Dr. Glantz worked with UCSF to ultimately deposit these documents at the UCSF library, where they could be kept safe, cataloged, and made available for other researchers to use. A year later, in 1995, Brown and Williamson did sue the university to try to remove the documents from the library. But by this point, copies of the documents were circulating in other places, and the university was able to argue that they were in the public domain, and so should be organized and made available to scholars and other parties. A California Superior Court judge ruled that removing the documents from the university would impact the public study of the material, and that there was, quote, a very strong public interest, end quote, in making the documents available. Brown and Williamson lost the appeal, and the library was able to make the documents public in the reading room. And then, since this was 1995, researchers could also get a copy on a CD-ROM. Meanwhile, litigation against the tobacco industry was continuing. By the early 1990s, several states had sued the largest cigarette manufacturers to recover healthcare costs incurred by Medicaid and other government health programs to treat smoking-related illnesses. And in 1997, 4 states, including Minnesota, reached settlement agreements to resolve these lawsuits. And thanks to Minnesota Attorney General Hubert Humphrey III, the Minnesota settlement included a groundbreaking requirement that the companies must make the documents disclosed during litigation available to the public. This was highly unusual, as in almost all cases, documents produced in discovery are sealed or they're destroyed after the conclusion of the case. But Attorney General Humphrey argued that the most important thing to come out of the litigation should be the truth. And this has been an incredible precedent for document disclosure in other cases. And this is really kind of the reason why we're seeing documents being disclosed from opioid litigation, looking all the way back to this, this groundbreaking decision by the Minnesota Attorney General. In 1998, the Master Settlement Agreement resolved all of the remaining lawsuits by 46 states, the District of Columbia, and 5 US territories. And it also included the requirement for documents to be made public for 10 years, which was one of the components of the settlement. And the MSA remains the largest civil litigation settlement in US history. So as the majority of these documents were pre-digital, going back to the 1950s, all of the documents had to be stored somewhere. And the tobacco companies were ordered to create document depositories where the public could go to review the material. So although the UCSF Industry Documents Library doesn't have an enormous warehouse full of paper documents, an enormous warehouse did exist, which housed thousands and thousands of boxes of documents. One depository was created in Minnesota, which contained over 27,000 boxes. And a second depository was located in Guildford near London, which housed another 6 to 7 million pages of documents related to the British American Tobacco Company. The Minnesota settlement also required continuing public disclosure of tobacco company documents, which were produced in any subsequent litigation relating to smoking and health in the US for 10 years. So in accordance with the terms of that settlement, documents produced that were not subject to protective orders or privilege claims had to be placed in the Minnesota depository within 30 days. They also had to be digitized and made available online through the tobacco companies' websites, which the companies were required to fund. So all of those documents housed in the depository were ultimately digitized and saved on computer tapes. And then the National Association of Attorneys General provided a copy of those tapes to the UCSF library so that they could be put online and made available freely to the public. The tapes initially contained more than 20 million pages of previously secret tobacco company documents, which formed the core of what was then called the Legacy Tobacco Documents Library, officially launched online in January of 2002. Every month since then, the library has downloaded millions of documents from the company's websites, and the collection has now grown to over 92 million pages. The Legacy Tobacco Documents Library was created with funding provided by the American Legacy Foundation, which is now known as the Truth Initiative, and the tobacco collections are now known as the Truth Tobacco Industry Documents Library. And of course, we acknowledge and thank the Truth Initiative for their long support to the library. Briefly, a little bit more about the British American tobacco documents, which were required to be disclosed by the Minnesota litigation, but they were not all placed in the Minnesota depository. So the vast majority of those documents were in the Guildford depository in the UK, and they were not posted online. So researchers either had to travel to the depository to search the collection, where they were subject to quite difficult conditions of access imposed by the company. Copy machines were not available, so copies had to be ordered, and they could take up to a year to be delivered. And researchers fought for years to try to get better access, ultimately spearheading a coalition of UCSF, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and the Mayo Clinic, with funding support from the Wellcome Trust, the American Heart Foundation, and the Flight Attendant Medical Research Institute. They formed the Guildford Archiving Project, which worked to order copies of all of the documents in the Guildford depository and to digitize them, a process which took more than 4 years. Those documents have now all been added to the library, and they continue to be freely and publicly available. In 1999, the US Department of Justice brought another civil lawsuit against the major tobacco companies, alleging that they had violated the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, and that they had conspired to mislead the public about the health hazards of smoking. In 2006, US District Judge Gladys Kessler found the tobacco companies liable, and she ordered them to continue making public any documents produced in litigation related to smoking and health for another 15 years. So this effectively extended the document disclosure provision from the Master Settlement Agreement. And the order in this RICO case lasted until September of 2021. So the Minnesota and Guilford depositories have now both closed to the public, so there are no more warehouses full of paper documents. But thanks to significant efforts of hundreds of people across different institutions, including UCSF, the Guilford Archiving Project, other partner organizations and funding organizations, the documents are all remaining available online. So with that history and background and context of where the tobacco documents came from, I'm going to briefly talk about the impact that they've had. The tobacco documents have been publicly available for research now for more than 20 years. And in that time, researchers and others have authored more than 1,000 publications citing the documents, including over 800 peer-reviewed books and articles, such as the major works here, and including Dr. Wei-Lu's book, Pushing Cool, which he was describing just in the keynote earlier. And researchers continue to be very heavily active in the archive, with academic papers published frequently across a wide range of topics and disciplines. And increasingly, as you'll hear later, authors are analyzing how other industries have adopted the same tactics as the tobacco industry. And these studies are contributing to a rapidly growing issue referred to as the commercial determinants of health. In addition to academic research, the documents have also been featured in investigative journalism and film, including the Chicago Tribune's award-winning series Playing with Fire, which investigated toxic flame retardants and the campaigns that the tobacco and chemical industries led to promote the use of those chemicals. Another example is the 2014 film Merchants of Doubt, which we highly recommend for those interested in getting an overview of documents, disclosure, and industry documents in general. And the film was directed by Robert Kenner, based on the 2010 book by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, and it investigates how a group of high-level scientists with extensive political and industry connections ran effective campaigns to mislead the public and deny well-established scientific knowledge about smoking, global warming, and other harms. So all of this research and investigation based on the tobacco documents has had a significant impact on public health policy. As just one example, California's tobacco control program, which has been informed by documents research conducted at UCSF and at other institutions, is credited with saving the state over $500 billion in medical costs between 1989 and 2018. And work with the tobacco documents has also made a national impact, with President Clinton stating that the tobacco documents analysis published in a 1995 special issue of the Journal of the American Medical Association informed his decision to move forward with a proposal to regulate nicotine, cigarettes, and smokeless tobacco. And then the 2009 Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act, signed by President Obama, ultimately gave the FDA the power to regulate the tobacco industry. And finally, at the international level, a report by experts on the tobacco industry documents was instrumental in developing the World Health Organization's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, the first global health treaty. Article 5.3 of the treaty is aimed at protecting public health policy from the influence of the tobacco industry. So this is all really to demonstrate that public access to such an unprecedented amount of previously internal tobacco industry documents has provided significant opportunities for all kinds of research, including further litigation in tobacco control policy, business ethics, history, and even areas such as product design and marketing, linguistics, and other domains. So as this research was unfolding, the library began to recognize the increasing research and public health interest into how other industries have adopted similar strategies to the tobacco industry, and so has begun collecting documents from the drug, the chemical, food, and fossil fuel industries. There have been fewer successful lawsuits resulting in document disclosure from these other industries, so these collections are still relatively small compared to the 15 million documents in the tobacco archive, but these collections still contain hundreds of thousands of pages. So across all of the collections in the Industry Documents Library, and this is including the documents in the Opioid Industry Documents Archive, we have over 106 million pages and over 18 million documents. So there is certainly a lot of data to explore. The UCSF Library also houses the Tobacco Control Archive, which preserves records of advocacy groups, government agencies, university research, and other materials related to tobacco control. So all of this work is really helping us to think about the opioid industry documents, maximizing the benefit of access to these materials, and thinking about the context both across the industry documents, the opioid industry documents themselves, but then within the larger collections of other industry materials, really kind of supporting these connections, analyses, networks, following the trail of public relations firms and other individuals connected across different industries. So turning now to the Opioid Industry Documents Archive itself. So in 2019, the team here at the Industry Documents Library began searching for documents that were becoming publicly available that related to the opioid industry. And in 2021, after several discussions of our common goals and interests, UCSF and Johns Hopkins University began our formal collaboration to build the Opioid Industry Documents Archive together to house the millions of documents that were starting to become available and are now being fully disclosed from opioid litigation. So the Opioid Industry Documents Archive, or the OIDA, is envisioned as a state-of-the-art digital archive of industry documents, advancing understanding of root causes of the opioid epidemic and preventing future harms. And UCSF and Johns Hopkins are both pursuing excellence in library science and information technology, digital archiving, as well as scholarship focused on many dimensions of the opioid epidemic, ranging from the history of medicine to pharmaceutical policy to clinical care. And as you can imagine, this is an enormous undertaking involving teams of librarians, technologists, scientists, historians, and other experts at both UCSF and Johns Hopkins, as well as staff from from state attorney general offices, plaintiffs' counsel, and a national advisory committee, which includes people with lived experience of the epidemic. So I'd like to thank all of those who work with us and support the archive, including our speakers, our archive staff, many of whom are here today, for their dedicated efforts to preserve these materials and make them available for the public's benefit. So to date, we have made over 3 million documents public, and we're processing millions more. Collections include internal industry documents publicly disclosed through major settlements with companies including Insys Therapeutics, Mallinckrodt, which was the largest generic manufacturer of opioids, and McKinsey & Company, which provided a lot of consulting services to Purdue Pharma, Mallinckrodt, and other companies. We also have included public materials from other state and city cases against opioid manufacturers and pharmacies, files obtained by journalists through court orders and Freedom of Information Act requests, and other publicly available documents from sources such as the multi-district litigation. And these documents are all being added to the Opioid Industry Documents Archive and are accessible through the Industry Documents Library website. So all of these opioid documents can be cross-searched with the IDL's other collections. And as with the tobacco industry documents, the opioid industry collections can inform studies of corporate knowledge, decisions, and actions relating to topics such as marketing, promotion, front groups, lobbying, and other activities. And just like the tobacco industry documents, there's enormous potential for far-reaching implications on academic research, journalism, law, health policy, legislation, and the protection and improvement of public health. And our next speakers will discuss their research experience and aims using the opioid industry documents to pursue questions on topics such as these. And the archive team is also undertaking significant work to enhance the user interface, the search tools, and to provide data sets to support research across lots of different disciplines, including those who are looking at computational analysis, digital humanities, and other forms of data science application. So academic research is already underway with several publications just in the past 2 years focused on the opioid documents. by researchers who are here, and many of you might also be conducting your own work and doing research in the archive. Please do let us know if you're doing this work so that we can make sure to keep track. We add all documents and publications that cite the documents to our overall bibliography. So we'd love to know about your work so that we can make sure that that's represented. The documents from the Opioid Industry Documents Archive have also been featured in some major investigative reporting by outlets such as the Washington Post and New York Times. And this is contributing to the ongoing national debate about how to hold the industry accountable and address the devastating opioid crisis in the US. The workshop later on is going to provide much more detail on how to get started searching in the Opioid Industry Documents Archive. So for now, I'm just going to point out a couple of key tools you can access. So this is just a shot of the homepage for the opioid industry documents in particular. You can see that it's situated within the industry documents library, and there is a menu across the top where you can select a particular industry archive or choose to search across all of the documents at once. And at the top right, you'll also find a menu of options where you can access news and updates about the documents. This is also where you can choose to subscribe to our newsletter if that's of interest. You'll also find a link to the bibliography, which lists all the publications that we're aware of, which cite the documents. And we have a set of research tools and resources to help guide you through the collections as well. And of course, you can also find contact information for the archive staff on the help page if you have additional questions. So with that, I will just say thank you so much for your interest in the Opioid Industry Documents Archive and the IDL in general. And we really encourage you to learn more and to stay in touch with us at the project through our newsletter, through social media, or by contacting our team to receive updates about new collections, webinars, research, and other opportunities to get involved. So I could take a few questions now, but also please feel free to contact me or other members of the team if we can answer further questions. And this will also be covered in the workshop portion later on as well. Thank you.
Oh, Kate, could you stop sharing your screen real fast? Yeah, sorry. Thank you so much, Kate. That was great. Great introduction. Yeah, for those of us in the workshop, we'll go over a little bit in more depth in terms of the searching and some of the tools available. But if anyone, has any questions who is not going to attend the workshop, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be as helpful as possible. One question, Kate, that came in, Adam looks like may have answered some of this from Julia Comiskey again. And her question was the scope of the archive. What are some of the non-US activities or documents that might be found in the collection? Adam was saying that those documents are limited, at least in the opioid industry records, but I wonder if you could speak really quickly about, if there is non-US material writ large that you may be aware of in the IDL as a whole.
Thank you, Jason, and thanks, Adam, and thank you for the question. So yes, because the documents are primarily obtained as a result of document disclosure from US-based lawsuits, the documents primarily are from the United States. There might be exceptions where a company is multinational, so British American tobacco records are in the Documents Archive, in the Tobacco Documents Archive, and there are other aspects of international business that might be captured, and then those documents have been produced as part of the litigation. So you'll find documents in the tobacco collections, for example, from Japan, from Holland. There are documents in other languages, but it is a much smaller proportion of the archive. We are collecting documents now from the opioid industry. Primarily, those documents, again, are coming from US lawsuits, and so they are more focused on the US. There's also considerations to be made about the legal ability that we have to collect documents from outside of the United States. So it's not a major focus of our collecting. We're looking at these documents that are coming out of the litigation. But we're always interested to hear from researchers about what you all need to do your work and your research, and if there are aspects of international business that would be of interest or help, please do get in touch with us and let us know what those areas would be.
Great, thanks, Kate, so much. Since we're sort of pressed for time, I'd like to move on to the next two quick presentations about folks who are currently undergoing research in the collection, and want them to give their insight and feedback on what they're finding and what they're researching. So I want to start with, we'll first start with Adam Kuhn, and again, for the sake of time, I'll let you all introduce yourselves, where you are, what kinds of research you do, and what in the collection you're specifically perhaps looking at. But maybe just quickly introduce yourselves first, and then we can go from there. So yeah, Adam, take it away. Take it away.
Sure. Thank you, Jason. And can you see my slides in full view?
I can.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm pleased to have the opportunity to share some of the research we've been conducting over the last a little over a year on actually the holdings in the Opioid Industry Document Archive. And a lot of what Dr. Welu mentioned in the opening talk resonates with our research team's experience, and I'll share a little bit about that. Before I get going, I am a faculty member in the International Health Department at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I do a lot of research on health taxes, particularly in the food and beverage industry, and this has led me to this work in part because corporate political strategy actually is fairly consistent and very creative across industries. I'll say that to begin, that the work I'm going to be talking about involved a team of people that were dedicated to this. Ross McKenzie in Australia, Ben Hawkins, both of these individuals have worked quite extensively with the Tobacco Archive in the past. Ben Hawkins is at Cambridge University. Daniel Eisencraft-Klein, who I think we are lucky to have with us actually on the webinar and possibly in the workshop later today. He's a PhD student at the University of Toronto. And then we had two master's students in our international health program, Sanaya Shenoy and Mustafa Ahmed. So together we creatively kind of, when you approach these archives, a lot is similar to the Tobacco Archive, but given the context in which these documents are being done, primarily the technological advances over the last 20 years, there are some differences. And we tried to point that out, when we were first exploring the archive to kind of define the contours of the stories that we thought were important for telling and were underrepresented in the public consciousness. And in the research domain, we put together a primer. There are great resources on the archive, which we do point to in this document as well. This is more for researchers, but there are great resources as well on the Opioid Industry Document Archive about how to begin and how to access different materials, suggested search terms, et cetera, some of which Kate just mentioned. If you're still looking for more and how this differs from the Tobacco Archive, feel free to check out this paper. So I want to talk about kind of three strands of our research and the way we went about identifying the strands of this research and then pursuing it once we knew what the heck it was we wanted to focus on. So this is a good example of, because it can be intimidating looking at all the holdings and they're constantly growing and things are returned to you, even if you order them by date, sometimes they're not by date. So you're trying to make sense of this just massive amount of data. And oftentimes, researchers follow hunches, and those hunches lead to dead ends, but sometimes they lead to productive means, to productive avenues for further research, and there's further branching down the road. We came across, this was an email that we saw early on in the archive, and some of you may have come across it who are familiar with the archive's holdings, written from an academic. Again, to Dr. Welu's, academics are a key part of this because they can be knowledge brokers. And in this case, a group at the University of Wisconsin who is involved in cancer care treatment, expanding access to cancer medications, end-of-life care for cancer and easing pain, had reached out to a lawyer that they work quite closely with, incidentally, it goes by the email address of Bill No Pain. And again, to Dr. Waylu's point, in this exchange, I didn't know what they were talking about when we first did this research. It didn't make a lot of sense. But it starts off with, I'm impressed that you could detect our fingerprints. I'll wear gloves next time. Anytime you see a line like that, you know that there's something there, that the person is admitting doing something that's, in maybe a tongue-in-cheek way, that maybe is not fully ethical or is ethically questionable. In this case, they were talking about the lawyer had reached out to them asking if they had a hand in some legal changes in one state. And again, once you get into the holdings, you realize that actually part of the corporate strategy was really focused on state level legislation and policymaking, because they had the ability to do that and they knew it worked. And these academics had worked to change this Intractable Pain Treatment Act statute to a general pain statute, which also removed the prescribing restrictions for quote unquote addicts. And again, in the context of 2005, they weren't convinced that that painkillers were actually addictive at this time. They were pretty convinced, the research group, we were come to learn that they were not. In fact, they published editorials in academic journals saying that, addiction was a myth. So after we looked at this, we looked at these Intractable Pain Treatment Act, and we also looked at the operation of this group for the federal, state medical boards. The director had worked through there, and they started removing things. They had worked with states to remove things like the prescription monitoring plans, which would flag providers who were, you would be able to track prescriptions for things like opioids. So we knew that this was something to follow, and then we saw the group surface again, particularly the leader, in a very carefully scripted statement in a hearing surrounding, in front of the U.S. Congress, surrounding the Pain Relief Promotion Act. And again, this is something that you might see mentioned in a lot of news stories, but President Clinton actually signed into law in the year 2000 a decade of pain control and treatment. And this was a symbolic act that would invest more resources and legitimize pharmaceutical corporations' pursuit of addressing kind of the crisis of untreated pain that they argued was persistent in the United States. So they're going to vote a decade. And now we since know in hindsight that decade is the decade when the opioid crisis really started escalating, and even right before it peaked. So again, we knew that this group and these individuals were very involved, but we didn't know a lot about them. But we did come across a research proposal that was submitted to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which started an initial project looking at scoring, this is in the archives holdings, that scored states according to their pain policies. And an A is actually limited pain policies. So that's more, there's greater access to pain control, painkillers, whereas a poorly performing state has more legal and regulatory hurdles. So in ranking states, there's particular language about, reducing the regulatory barriers to pain access. And you can see this was funded by, major philanthropic organizations and grant-making bodies in the United States. This group, this report is from 2014, and it was, some of their older reports are in the archive, but we used this archive as a way to kind of direct us, and then we would then do searches broader through other materials. One of the ways that their website had been removed, but one of the ways that you can get, it's imperfect, is using like something like the Wayback Machine. So we're able to, this crawls the internet and looks at websites and archives them in a fairly regular way, even though it's also got lots of holes and bugs and stuff. But this was a useful way to look at how the group's activities. Since then, we have, they started this, the IPPF in your upper right, it's a pain policy fellowship that they held with international participants who would fly in and learn about how to reduce regulatory barriers to painkillers in their countries. There were online courses, and opioid consumption was a good thing for this group. So we have since then launched a whole program. I mean, we have several different research endeavors tied to the activities of these very influential knowledge brokers. And a lot of what they did was published, is in the peer-reviewed journal, are in peer-reviewed journals, and we've coded that data, and we're now looking at it and hopefully in a position to share some of the findings soon. Another, again, so the importance with the archive is that this helps point you in the right direction. It says there's something there, and maybe the full scale of the group's activities and how they interacted with other kind of industry-friendly academics, consultants, and by the way, they were being paid by Purdue Pharma at the time. Maybe all of this is hard to piece together exactly using the archive, but it serves as kind of a launch point and a frequent reference point as you go through these kind of these iterative cycles of interpretation with different sources of data. The second research theme has been led by Daniel Eisencraft-Klein. And this looks at, again, as Dr. Welu mentioned, industry pushes products. Well, a lot of the pharmaceutical corporations have argued that they're filling demand and for needed painkillers for people that need them, and that the deviants, the people who are abusing these, are a small number of individuals. Well, we looked at, we disagree, and the archive shows that large corporations, particularly Mallinckrodt, which had the largest market share of the market for painkillers at the peak of the crisis, actually developed these very proactive sales strategies that had things like sales competitions. And we developed this. This is a sheet from their Operation Change Agent, where they were actually instructing healthcare providers for how to switch from OxyContin under regulatory scrutiny to their products, which were largely generic brands of hydrocodone. We did a structured search for this after we knew kind of broadly that we wanted to look at these sales strategies. What were the incentives? What were some of the attractive points, and what were the nuts and bolts for how they worked? There's in the archive, there's things like this. This is the brand acceleration plan. A lot of the strategic planning actually was documented and is available in the archive. Daniel very cleverly developed search strategy looking at sales competitions. And we have a paper now that's under review that's looking at all of the different ways that sales teams were incentivized to increase their margins. If you read the newsletter, the Force, there is lots of language about, the highly emotive aspect of selling your product. This is an example. Put some emotion in your sales, become a maniac on a mission. This is not what a sales team that's filling demand would do. This is actually generating demand. And these competitions that are well documented actually in the archive, I think we found something like 440 plus hits when we narrowed our search strategy, provide a window into how these corporations actually generated demand over time, which resulted in a public health crisis. And then finally, one of our more recent streams, we had a master's student that looked at how the corporations that are part of the opioid crisis respond to allegations of wrongdoing. And the theory is that actually in some industries, when companies are challenged with these threats to their business model that severely inhibit kind of public perceptions of their business dealings, they can create, arguments or defenses and public apologies that are actually enhancing their market position, because they may seem like apologies, but they're actually corporate defenses masquerading as apologies. We came up with this because we first noticed the crisis playbook put together by HDMA in the Opioid Industry Document Archive. It shows what to do when, who to contact, at which regulatory agency or which network of actors. And that got us thinking that actually how these corporations are responding is really important. This is actually featured in, I think the hot takes or the hot docs, a series of resources that are put together by the archive team. So we looked at, we wanted to go, however, a little bit deeper. So we looked at a business and management studies kind of framework that deconstructs these types of apologies. And apologies are a very specific type of corporate kind of phenomenon. And we focus on the crisis response and then how ethical they were. I don't have time to go into each of what counterattack, differentiation, transference, apology, and legal responses are, but many of these are fairly intuitive. A lot of the crisis response is denial, where the organizations just say they didn't do anything wrong. Counterattack is where they actually redirect to counter the accuser, assuming the position of victim, exploiting kind of sense of moral justice. Differentiation is where they actually distance themselves from wrongdoing by attempting to redefine it, explain it, etc. And transference is scapegoating, where the company is not to blame, but maybe somebody within the company, few rogue actors are to blame. So if we applied this to actually 3 companies that are somewhat different, and part of our criteria is we wanted to know, we wanted a diversity of crisis communication tactics. We understand how they were responding to these allegations. And then they had to be somewhat influential, and they had to be present in the archive. But again, like our first stream, the universe of our data sources were not necessarily archival material, because in fact, some of these apologies are actually fairly recent, and the litigation predates some of the apologies. That said, Mallinckrodt, the largest opioid manufacturer to settle to date, we looked at Mallinckrodt, we compared it to McKinsey, who also issued a very formal and carefully scripted public apology. McKinsey & Company is not, they're a management company, and they work in a variety, they're a management consulting firm, they work in a variety of different fields. Healthcare is just one of them. And then the Joint Commission on Hospital Accreditation, which sets clinical guidelines and standards. You might think of pain as the 5th vital sign and pain scales. A lot of the changes that this group in Wisconsin and a lot of other industry actors issued that were sponsored by philanthropic organizations, actually. The changes to the clinical treatment guidelines through the Joint Commission allowed or created incentives for providers to change their behavior. Remember, consumers can't select these products. Providers served as gatekeepers. So when we compared them, we found with Mallinckrodt outright denial. There was some corrective action, although we would argue that this was largely forced by a court of law. And then there was quite a bit of differentiations seeking to kind of explain away any allegations of wrongdoing. McKinsey & Company, keep in mind that they're actually part of their remit when they consult with other companies and with the federal government and governments around the world is to actually draft apologies when they're faced with allegations of wrongdoing. So they also denied wrongdoing, and also, unlike Mallinckrodt, there's a transference where some of their statements of guilt actually allude to, a few bad actors, but not the company itself is facing as doing anything wrong. And they do talk about corrective action, even if it's not terribly sincere. And then finally, the Joint Commission, which actually has only been sued once in West Virginia. They are a non-governmental organization. However, I'd argue in the absence of a real robust regulatory system for healthcare in the United States, they have an outsized kind of role in healthcare in the regulation of health service delivery. And they've flat out counterattacked and have engaged in a fair amount of differentiation, explaining away. And in fact, they went as far as one of the leaders developing 5 common myths about actually the Joint Commission's role in the opioid crisis. We think, again, so this is the type of research that you can do with the archive. We think it's important to pursue. The archive is an exciting place. There's plenty of material for everyone. It's constantly evolving. It is incomplete because of that. And for us, it's been an important springboard and a frequent reference point as we go and explore all these phenomena through different avenues. So I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has.
All right. Thanks, Adam. That was wonderful. And just because we're again pressed for time, I want to jump right into a different research perspective here from GB out of Babson College, excuse me. So if you want to just take it away, introduce yourself, and yeah, tell us a little bit more about how you're using the collection and some of the research you're doing as well.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Thank you. All right. I am Gaurav Bardwaj, or GB, and I am a professor at a business school called Babson. We are out here in Massachusetts. I teach strategy to undergraduates, MBAs, and to executives. And this is important because it influences how I approach my research, because the aim ultimately is that we should be teaching our students to not do harm. So with that little bit of background, I'll talk a little bit about my research and then how I have been using the opioid documents. So my research program is really just trying to understand how executives in the opioid industry, how did they make decisions that ended up causing so much harm to patients, families, society. And I have, in my discipline, articles are, very important. And so I have an article right now under review where I discovered that OxyContin was called a wonder drug or a miracle drug and even an ideal drug. And I discovered, looking at the medical literature, that there was no evidence that it was any better than any drug that already existed in the market. So a brand new drug that claims to be a miracle drug, if you look at the clinical evidence, it isn't. It isn't better than anything that existed. So in many respects, there was no reason for OxyContin to be launched in the market. And so that's what the first paper is about. And I'm working on another paper on how the focus here is on marketing, and how marketing is so focused on getting the sale that they never looked at patients and their lives. And even while the epidemic is growing, there's no difference in the decision-making at these companies. So that's a second paper. In my discipline, you have to, papers must develop new theory. You can't just tell a story. You have to use the story to develop a new theory. And so that's the third paper that you see listed up here. And my intention is to write a book. The working title is Profit, Truth, and Lives, with a focus really on Purdue Pharma and McKinsey, and to look at their decision-making over almost 25 years. So that's a book project a little further down the line. I am also working on a paper where I'm using the drug industry documents rather than the opioid. And there is a collection on blood products. And this paper is important and connects with the opioid work because it's easy for people to dismiss, one company to say, oh, well, they are an outlier. And what you want to show is that there is a pattern, a common pattern in decision-making. So this allows me to show some similar patterns that were taking place many years earlier in a different segment of sort of healthcare. So that's sort of my research program on dollars and lives. And my approach is, as I mentioned, to use these stories to build theory. And I would another way to describe my research and approach is that I'm writing a microhistory of analysis. So my focus is really on how people analyze and think. The reason this is important is because this is what we teach in business schools. And there are very few examples of harm. Most of our teaching is very prescriptive, that this is the best way to make decisions, but we don't have very many good examples of how companies have made harmful decisions. So it's sort of a microhistory. And what I'm doing is I'm supplementing the opioid documents with the literature in medicine. And I'm getting documents on competition, in the industry, and using a lot of newspaper sources as well. So that's the broad approach. And I'm going to go in a little bit deeper here in explaining how I have approached the opioid archive. So I actually started work on this project before the opioid documents were made available, before OIDA was formed. And so previously, I was gathering information from contemporary news stories and legal documents. And this ended up being very helpful because I learned quite a bit, and I was able to use that to search the opioid archive. So here's how I approached it. So you can see the non-OIDA sources that I used were congressional hearings, medical and public health literature, CDC, Department of Justice, the state AG offices, particularly the one in Massachusetts, where I live, news organizations, ProPublica, Stat News, Washington Post, New York Times. These led me to a whole bunch of legal documents. And of course, there have been several books that have come out. So this knowledge that I gathered from these other sources helped me in my OIDA search by focusing on people, events, decisions. And the last bullet point I will explain is I use the footnotes and exhibits of legal documents to chase corporate documents within OIDA. So far, I have focused on Purdue Pharma and McKinsey. I will expand to other organizations a little bit later. I believe I have read just about everything there is to read from the early 90s to 2005. Initially, the document collection was small enough that I actually read everything. But some of the recent collections are just too big. And just for amusement, I did the math. To go through 3.09 million documents, it'll take me 28 years if I just browse spend 90 seconds on each document. So clearly, you need a strategy. I need a strategy. So here are the approaches I've taken that I've found useful. This is a screenshot of the main page that you go to. I used to check this every day, and I would go to you can see this fluorescent arrow on the bottom right. That's where the website will post a link to a new article every day. And I used to go there every day. And it led me to some really incredibly, it's luck plays a role here, but it led me to some really useful stuff. So if you click on the link, so it says New York Times, how doctors help drive the addiction crisis. So you click on that, it takes you to this page. And here, this is invaluable, right? Because I'm interested in how people make decisions. So you can see now that this New York Times article is being discussed within McKinsey. And now you have the names of all the players involved, right, on the document itself, but also on the right side of your screen, you can see who the recipients are, and you can see who the author is. And so I can sort of make a note of these individuals, and I can then search using their name. On the upper right corner, where the arrow shows you, there are those three links. previous next baits, browse, and more like this. I found that to be extremely helpful. So once I identify an article that is really important, I then, so as you can see here, when I click on browse, it gives me, and you can see in the top row, the beige colored one, that's the original document. And there's a whole series of documents on the right and then on the left of that row. So what I've done is I've gone right up to 10, 15, 20 documents, and then I've gone left 10, 15, 20 documents. And you come across amazingly useful things. And, so here's something similar. You do find different sets of documents using each of these tabs or links. And you can see over here, it's a different set of documents now in the top row. And now let's look at the third link where it says more like this. I was surprised. Here's a document on Mike Pence slow walking needle something, right? That's completely unexpected. So that, I'm going to download that, put that document in the middle of my screen, and then use that to search for other documents. There's an interesting one on the FDA over here. So this approach has been very helpful for me. This is the document that got me started in January 2019. The Wall Street Journal carried an article on Purdue Pharma the day Maura Healey, who's now the governor of Massachusetts, but when she was the AG, when she sued Purdue Pharma. And they had a link to this complaint. I downloaded this, and this is what got me started. I was stunned by what I read. And I started gathering documents from multiple places. But now within this document, there are exhibits. So there's an attachment A, and you can see the documents that they have listed with some kind of a reference. Now on the OIDA website, of course, they may have different labels, but at least the names are the same. So I've used this to then go and search. Here are a couple of other examples. So, you look at on the left side, 206, it says they were making more money than expected. They had a projected profit of 407 million, but they're now planning, they expect to make more than 600 million. And then you have these citations to board reports, and you can see the number of citations on the right side of your screen over here. I then go and look for them. And they're not always there, but sometimes I do find other documents that are related. The McKinsey collection has grown staggeringly, and I know it's going to grow even more. So this has been very helpful. I used to actually keep a spreadsheet of my searches because at some point, my fear was I would be repeating searches that I had already done. So I have a spreadsheet for the last couple of years with all the searches I've done, not all, but most. And these are the field names that are mentioned in the help section of the website. The ones that I have used are the author, organization, title, recipient, and mentioned. I found that to be a very useful one. And it reminds me of, what Keith Value was talking about, how a single word can get you going. That's kind of what I found over here. So using this search mechanism was very helpful to me. What else helped? The bibliography section of the website helped, because I would go and read all the articles that are in the bibliography, because I figured someone has done the research and found something useful. It's worth my knowing what it is. So I have benefited a lot from the bibliography as well, and by going into these links. And so just in closing, this is the archive is extraordinary. In my discipline, which is strategy and management, it's just it's really truly stunning to read these documents. Why? Because companies don't like to reveal how they make decisions, particularly decisions that cause harm. So all the documents on the website are invaluable. So it has allowed me to study questions and develop ideas that I would not have been able to do otherwise. And it has informed my teaching. And I have taken certain examples of decision-making at Purdue and McKinsey into my classroom with undergraduates and MBAs. And rather than tell them what happened, I give them information piece by piece and have them make the decision. And then we talk about what actually happened. And it's very startling for them to see the divergence between how they're thinking and how some of the decisions these companies made. So that's my talk. This is my contact information. I think one way for all of us to benefit is to learn from each other. How we search and what we are running into, what we are encountering. So I hope through this webinar and workshop, we can build a community of people working on these documents.
Thanks so much. And that's a wonderful segue as we start to move into the workshop phase about, this collaborative effort, working together or building that research community that one of the main goals of this event is to build out the number of folks who want to engage with this collection or these collections, generate questions, answer questions, or start to answer questions about some of these phenomena that could be found in the OIDA and the industry library writ large. So since our workshop is going to be starting at 1 o'clock, which is in 6 minutes, I want everyone who is participating in the workshop to take a quick break. I will open up the workshop Zoom room for those who are attending the workshop. So you could start populating in there and we'll start at 1 o'clock. But before that, I want to thank everybody for not only attending, but especially all of the participants and panelists who provided insight into how we can start to engage with this collection. And as the OIDA builds in volume, it's already quite large, but it's going to get larger. We can see with the work of people like Dr. Welu and others who have used previous IDL collections, as models for building on how we can engage with what is ostensibly a different set of topics and themes, but obviously are definitely connected to one another in terms of how we actually research and answer and ask questions of the opioid industry collection as well. So with that, I just want to say thank you. Round of applause. Yay, everybody. This is wonderful. And I look forward to everyone who's going to be in the workshop. And thank you all again for attending. And have a great day.